Daniel had always walked the high ridges of Montana with quiet respect. He wasn't a man who came looking for trouble or stories. After 30 years as a park ranger, now retired, he still wandered those trails because the land called to him. The pines creaked, the creeks ran fast with snow melt, and the air carried a kind of honesty he had never found anywhere else. That morning he wasn't searching for anything unusual, only the calm rhythm of a long hike. But the forest had other plans. The first sign came as a sound, a faint cry, thin and uneven, floating up from a hollow between boulders. Daniel froze. Out here, sounds mattered. Elk bugles, raven calls, even the whisper of wind could mean something. But this sound was wrong. Too small to belong to the larger forest animals. Too desperate to be ignored. He stood still for a moment, listening. The cry came again, then stopped. Silence settled heavily, and he felt his chest tighten. For most hikers, the instinct might have been to walk on, to dismiss it as a bird call or the echo of something far away. Daniel, though, carried years of knowing what it meant when a creature's voice cracked like that. Pain, fear, a plea, however small. So he left the trail. His boots broke through patches of frozen ground as he climbed toward the sound. Each step brought the scent of pine needles and damp earth and something else, something faint, almost metallic like rust. He found the cub huddled in the shadow of a crate. A grizzly bear cub, no older than a few months, was small enough that his paws looked oversized for his body. His fur was patchy, clumped, and dull. He looked up, eyes wide, then shrank back as Daniel approached. What held Daniel in place, though, wasn't only the sight of the animal. It was the scrap of paper nailed to the crate. The words scrawled in black marker read, "He's better off gone." A jagged smiley face had been drawn beneath it. For a moment, Daniel just stood there, breath shallow. He had seen wild animals injured by traps, struck by cars, and weakened by harsh winters. But this was something else. Someone had left the cub here deliberately with a note that mocked his suffering. That twist of cruelty shook him in a way the wilderness never had. Nature was hard, yes, but it wasn't spiteful. This was something human. The cub tried to stand but stumbled. His legs shook and he collapsed back into the damp earth. Daniel stepped closer, moving slowly, lowering his voice to a calm murmur. He had no illusions. This was a grizzly, even if still young. An instinct could flare into claws and teeth at any second. But the cub didn't lunge. He only blinked, shivering as if too weak to resist. Daniel knew the risks. A mother grizzly could be nearby, and interfering with cubs was one of the most dangerous mistakes anyone could make in the Rockies. But there was no scent trail, no tracks, no low rumble from the trees. The cub was alone, and the note was proof this wasn't a case of a lost cub wandering too far. Someone had put him here. He crouched, studying the animal. The signs were clear to him. The cub was malnourished, ribs pressing against skin movements, sluggish. There was a faint crust around one eye, possibly an infection. His breathing came shallow, almost wheezy. Left here another day, maybe even another hour, and the forest would claim him. Coyotes, wolves, or the cold night air, it didn't matter which. Daniel's hand shook as he reached for his pack. He pulled out a worn flannel shirt and wrapped it slowly around the cub, careful not to startle him. The cub flinched but did not fight. In his weakness, there was trust, or maybe just surrender. Either way, Daniel could not walk away. Carrying him down the slope was harder than expected. Though small, the cub was still heavy, a bundle of muscle and bone beneath thinning fur. Each step jarred Daniel's shoulders. His breath came fast in the thin mountain air, but he kept moving. With each shift of weight, the cub whimpered softly, a sound that seemed to echo in Daniel's ribs. Here is where a small lesson sat waiting, one Daniel knew well. Compassion isn't convenient. It doesn't arrive when your arms are free or your back is strong. It shows up when you're tired, when the path is steep, when every reason says leave it and something deeper says don't. That morning, compassion asked him to carry more than his own weight. And he did. At the trailhead, Daniel pulled his phone from his jacket. The signal was weak but steady. He called Mountain Haven Wildlife Rescue a sanctuary known across Montana for stepping into impossible situations. He explained what he had found the cub, the note, the condition, and listened to the dispatcher's sharp inhale on the other end. "Stay with him," she said. "Help is coming." While waiting, Daniel sat on a fallen log, the cub bundled against him. His mind wandered as it often had in moments of stillness. How many wild animals had been discarded like this, unseen? How many abandoned souls, both human and animal, never found by the right pair of eyes? He thought of the countless reports he'd heard over the years: black bear cubs shot in orchards, polar bears starving on thinning ice, stray cats left to fend in empty buildings. Different species, aim indifference. But here in his arms was one life, one chance to tip the scale. He tightened his grip, whispering. The cub's breathing steadied, not from healing yet, but from the simple warmth of contact. When the rescue truck pulled into the clearing, Daniel felt both relief and a pang of sorrow. Handing the cub over meant trusting others now. It meant letting go. Yet it was also the only way forward. The rescuers lifted the cub gently, voices low, eyes trained with years of practice. One of them placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, nodding. "You did the right thing. You gave him a chance." The idea that helping doesn't require certainty of the ending. Daniel hadn't known if the cub would survive. He hadn't known whether the note's cruelty had already sealed his fate. But he chose action over apathy. That choice more than outcome defined the day. As the truck pulled away, Daniel watched the dust rise behind it. His chest felt lighter, though his arms ached. In the silence, the forest returned to its rhythms, the wind, the creaks, the calls of ravens overhead. He stood there for a while, boots rooted hard, unsettled, yet steadier than when he arrived. It was only the beginning. The cub's journey would unfold far beyond that trail, through clinics, foster care, and perhaps a sanctuary built for beings like him. Daniel, for his part, walked back into the trees, carrying with him not the cub, but the memory of a choice made in the Rockies, a choice that would ripple further than he could see. The real fight, though, would begin not in the wild, but in the hands of those ready to heal him. And for this grizzly bear cub, that fight started the moment he arrived at Mountain Haven Wildlife Rescue. The ride to Mountain Haven Wildlife Rescue felt longer than the winding road allowed. Daniel followed the truck in his old pickup headlights, bouncing across gravel, mind replaying every whimper of the grizzly bear cub. He had carried many animals out of danger in his career. Injured elk, tangled in wire, black bears sedated for relocation, even the occasional wolf caught in a trap. But this was different. This was a cub who should have been under the watch of a mother in the forest, not abandoned with a cruel note. When they arrived, the sanctuary team moved quickly. No dramatic shouts, just practiced calm. A vet named Dr. Sue. Harris knelt beside the cub as soon as he was lifted onto the exam table. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He checked the cub's eyes with a small light, listened to his chest with a stethoscope, and gently pulled back the fur around his neck to reveal skin crawling with parasites. "Malnourished," Harris said, voice steady but edged with concern. "Dehydrated. Worms. Early signs of respiratory stress." Daniel stood close, torn between wanting to help and knowing this part was out of his hands. He watched as a syringe filled with fluids slid under the cub's skin. A faint twitch, then stillness. The cub's breathing grew more even, though still shallow. Harris explained as he worked partly for his team, partly for Daniel. Grizzly bear cubs this age depend almost entirely on their mother for milk and protection. Without her, they decline fast. "We'll stabilize him first. If he makes it through the night, his odds improve." It was the kind of moment that could make even seasoned rescuers uneasy. The cub's life hung in a balance too thin for guarantees. But in the small details there were sparks of hope. His gums were pale but not white, meaning blood still carried some strength. His muscles, though weak, responded faintly to touch. And most telling of all, he hadn't given up completely. He blinked, shifted slightly, clung to life in the quiet way animals often do. The first example of progress came quicker than expected. After the fluids, a caretaker named Emily placed a warmed bottle to the cub's mouth. At first, he turned his head uninterested, But then, after a long pause, he latched on. The sound of milk slipping down his throat filled the room like a fragile promise. Everyone exhaled at once, even Daniel, who hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. That first swallow was more than nourishment. It was a statement he wanted to live. Here lies the small lesson that people often forget when talking about wildlife rescue. Survival isn't always about dramatic fights or roaring strength. Sometimes it's measured in sips of formula, in the way a weakened animal chooses to take one more breath, one more chance. Those quiet moments are victories as important as any loud triumph. Through the night, volunteers worked in shifts. The cub was cleaned, treated for parasites, and given antibiotics to fight infection. He whimpered, pawed weakly, then settled into exhausted sleep. The sanctuary kept records on a whiteboard time of feeding dosage of medicine and temperature checks. Daniel watched from the corner, unwilling to leave. He wasn't family, not technically even part of the team, but something inside him insisted he stay. He had found the cub in the Rockies. He wanted to see the first signs of healing with his own eyes. Morning light streamed through the clinic windows. The cub stirred, stretching one paw before curling again. Harris returned, checked vitals, and finally allowed himself a faint smile. He made it through the night. The words hung in the air, heavier than they sounded. In rescue work, nights are the hardest battles. The fact that the cub had survived this one meant a door had opened to the possibility of recovery. The fresh perspective came when Daniel realized the rescue wasn't about one man saving a cub. It was a web of effort, veterinarians, volunteers, donors, and sanctuaries all pulling together. He thought about the hiker who had first reported cries in the distance, about the dispatcher who had sent the rescue truck, about the unseen supporters whose donations bought the formula and medicine. One choice had sparked another, and together they created a chain strong enough to hold this small life. Later that day, Harris sat with Daniel for a moment, offering clarity. "We'll keep him under close watch. If he continues to gain strength, we'll transfer him to a foster environment where he can build trust and grow. It's a long process. Some make it, some don't, but we owe him the chance." The words weren't sugar-coated, but they carried a weight of responsibility. This wasn't about promises, it was about commitment. Daniel nodded. He understood. In the wild, grizzlies live with odds every day, weather, predators, hunger. But in human care, the odds were tilted by compassion, by science, by people choosing not to turn away. That choice mattered. It was the line between abandonment and sanctuary, between silence and survival. The cub's timeline began to unfold in notes on the whiteboard and in Daniel's memory. First fluid injection, first bottle feed, first long sleep. Each milestone small as it seemed stacked into something larger, a path forward. The contrast from the crate in the forest to the clinic table was stark. There he had been left with nothing but a mocking note. Here he was surrounded by hands that carried care instead of harm. There was, of course, no guarantee. Wildlife rescues knew this truth too well, but Daniel found himself thinking less about guarantees and more about responsibility. It wasn't about predicting the future. It was about showing up now, about holding the cub's fragile present long enough for the future to even exist. Before leaving the clinic that afternoon, Daniel leaned close to the small form curled in blankets. He didn't touch him, didn't want to intrude, but whispered anyway. "You're safe now." The cub's ear twitched slightly as if catching the sound. Whether he understood or not didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had said it and meant it. This is where many viewers might wonder why. Save one grizzly bear cub when the forests are still full of struggle. Why invest so much time, energy, and money for a single life? The answer is simple, though often overlooked, because lives are not measured in numbers. Each rescue is both a survival story and a reminder. It shows us that compassion isn't about scale, it's about presence. Saving one doesn't solve everything, but it changes everything for that one. And sometimes that's enough to keep us human. As Daniel walked back to his truck, the sanctuary's staff still bustling behind him, he felt a shift. Yesterday, he had been a retired ranger hiking old trails. Today, he was part of something larger, something ongoing. It wasn't only about the cub. It was about what people chose to do when faced with cruelty. Do they turn away, or do they carry the weight however heavy? The sanctuary had the answer. They carried it. But even with medicine and care, survival would depend on something harder to measure trust. And that was the next mountain the cub would have to climb. Healing the body was one battle, but healing the heart was another. Medicine could treat worms, fluids could fight dehydration, but nothing could erase the memory of abandonment. Every time a hand reached toward him, the cub recoiled. Every time a voice grew too loud, he pressed into the corner of his crate. Emily and Marcus, the foster caregivers chosen for him, understood this rhythm well. They had seen black bear cubs flinch at shadows, fox kits hide from every sound, and even owls snap their beaks at the sight of people. Trauma in wild animals doesn't vanish with food. It lingers in how they breathe, how they move, how they sleep. That first week, their work was less about feeding schedules and more about patience. Marcus tried simple actions, sitting quietly near the cub's enclosure, eyes lowered, hands still. He didn't force eye contact. He didn't speak much. He let the cub learn that silence could be safe. Emily brought a small blanket warmed by the dryer and set it near the cub, never pushing it close, just letting him decide if he wanted its comfort. Slowly over hours, the cub crept forward, sniffed and curled against the fabric. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the start of choosing safety over fear. There's an explanation here worth pausing on. In wildlife rescue, trust is not built like in domestic animals. A dog might wag its tail after a day of kindness. A cat might purr after a week of gentle care. But wild animals carry instincts honed over generations. For a grizzly bear cub, people are not family. They are danger. Rescuers must honor that line, offering care without expecting affection, protecting without demanding gratitude. Trust, if it comes, is a fragile bridge, and it must be walked lightly. The first example of progress came one evening when Emily placed a shallow dish of milk replacement on the ground, then stepped back. The cub hesitated, ears twitching, body tense. For long minutes, he did nothing. Then hunger overcame fear. He stepped forward, dipped his muzzle, and drank. When he finished, he didn't retreat to the farthest corner. He stayed where he was, eyes glancing at Emily, but not darting away. It was a small shift, but Marcus whispered, "He's learning we're not here to harm him." Healing is not linear. People often expect rescued wild animals to transform quickly, to go from trembling to trusting in a week, from silence to play in a few days. But just as trauma in humans doesn't vanish overnight, neither does it for animals. The struggle for trust takes time, and time itself becomes the medicine. Days stretched into weeks. The cub began to test his boundaries. At first, it was cautious play, pawing at a rope toy, sniffing a ball of leaves, tumbling clumsily across a pile of straw. His fear hadn't vanished, but it now shared space with curiosity. That balance mattered. Curiosity meant his spirit was waking up. Emily noticed that he startled less at voices, though he still flinched at sudden movement. Marcus noticed he sometimes approached the enclosure door when they entered, not close enough to touch, but near enough to watch. These small acts told a bigger story. Trust was growing not as a leap, but as steady steps. A fresh perspective came when Harris the vet explained this process to a group of volunteers. Trust in wild animals isn't about turning them into pets. It's about giving them a chance to live without fear. The cub may never see us as family, and that's okay. Our goal is not to tame him, but to heal him enough that he can thrive, whether that's in the wild or in a sanctuary. His words reframed the journey. This wasn't about creating companionship. It was about restoring dignity. What many don't realize is that trust also shapes survival. A cub that refuses to eat because of fear will fade. A cub that lashes out constantly can injure itself or others. Building trust means giving the animal a reason to live, to engage with his environment, to accept care. Without that, even the best medical treatment falls short. One evening, Daniel returned to visit. He stood near the enclosure, watching the cub from a distance. When the cub didn't retreat, Daniel slowly crouched, resting his hands on his knees. "You've come far," he murmured, not expecting a response. The cub blinked, tilted his head and then for the first time took 2 slow steps toward the barrier. He stopped just a foot away, nose twitching, eyes bright. For Daniel, that single step carried more weight than any words. It was a bridge being built, plank by plank. Community members often ask what they can do when they hear stories like this. The answer is not glamorous, but it is powerful. Learn to recognize signs of neglect or abuse in animals and report them early. Cruelty often hides in silence in abandoned barns in forgotten fields. The cub in Montana had been found because someone listened to his cry and cared enough to speak up. Without that, he might never have reached the sanctuary. The struggle for trust begins with someone noticing someone acting. As weeks passed, Emily and Marcus kept journals of the cub's progress. First meal without flinching. First play session lasting more than 10 minutes. First nap in open space instead of a hidden corner. Each entry read like a timeline of resilience. The difference between the cub in the Rockies, weak, shivering, abandoned with a mocking note, and the cub now exploring his enclosure was stark. It was a before and after story, not of physical health alone, but of spirit. And yet the mystery lingered. Who had left him in that crate? Why had someone chosen cruelty over care? Those questions had no answers, and maybe they never would. But the team agreed on one thing: the cub's story mattered less for its dark beginning than for what it revealed about compassion. It showed that trust, once broken, can still be rebuilt, not perfectly, not quickly, but enough to change a life. One evening, Marcus found the cub curled on the blanket Emily had given him weeks before. He wasn't shaking anymore. He was breathing evenly, eyes half closed, safe enough to rest. That was trust. Not in the way humans often imagine it, with hugs or closeness, but in the quiet act of surrendering fear long enough to sleep. The takeaway for viewers is clear. Trust, whether in wild animals or in people, is rarely about grand gestures. It's about consistent actions that prove safety, about showing up day after day, even when the other side resists. In a world quick to demand instant results, this cub's slow journey reminds us that real trust is built patiently, gently, one choice at a time. By the end of that month, the cub had gained weight. His coat had begun to thicken, and his eyes carried a spark of curiosity that had been absent in the Rockies. The struggle was far from over, but the foundation had been laid. He had not only survived, he had begun to trust enough to live. And with trust came the chance for something even greater, the rediscovery of play's strength and the first signs of real recovery. The first real sign that the grizzly bear cub was turning a corner came quietly. One afternoon, Emily left a small log inside the enclosure. Nothing unusual, just a piece of wood stripped of bark, smooth enough to roll. For days it sat untouched. Then, without warning, the cub ambled over, pawed at it once, and gave it a clumsy shove. The log rolled forward. He froze, tilted his head, then batted it again. The sound of his claws tapping wood echoed in the barn. That was the moment the team knew recovery wasn't only physical. Something inside him was beginning to wake. Play is often underestimated in wildlife rescue, but Harris explained why it mattered. When a cub plays, he's telling us he feels safe enough to waste energy. In the wild, play is practice for survival, chasing, wrestling, and climbing. For a rescued cub, it's proof his fear no longer rules every movement. That single game with a log was more than a distraction. It was a declaration life was worth engaging with again. Recovery. Unfolded like that, measured in moments rather than milestones. His first full meal eaten without hesitation. His first nap in sunlight, stretched on straw instead of huddling in the shadows. His first growl, soft and clumsy, was when Marcus teased him with a dangling rope. Each of these actions carried weight far beyond its simplicity. There were signs that the cub was no longer surviving on instinct alone. He was choosing to live. Healing often looks ordinary. To an outsider, a cub swatting at a log may not seem like much. But when you know the history, the crate in the Rockies, the mocking note, the shivering body, that same action becomes extraordinary. It reminds us that progress rarely arrives in grand gestures. It hides in the small things, a sip, a nap, a game. Daniel returned often sometimes, just standing quietly by the fence. On one visit, he watched the cub climb awkwardly onto a pile of rocks the volunteers had arranged. The cub scrambled, slipped, then reached the top and stood tall, chest puffed. Daniel smiled. "That's the look of someone who knows he belongs here," he whispered. It was an example of how resilience can shift the spirit, how even a young wild animal carries pride when given the chance to thrive. The fresh perspective emerged in the contrast between before and after. Before, dull eyes, ribs visible, silence broken only by weak whimpers. After, glossy coat beginning to return, curiosity sparking in each movement, the barn echoing with soft growls and the thump of paws. This contrast wasn't just visual, it carried meaning. It showed that cruelty hadn't won. That abandonment hadn't written the final line of his story. What made these signs powerful was the timeline. Within the first week, he had stabilized. By the second, he was playing. By the third, his weight began to climb steadily. Emily noted in her journal, "He rolled in straw today, pawed at my boots from a distance, still cautious but brave enough to test." Marcus wrote, "First nap with belly exposed." That means trust. Each entry documented recovery not as a straight path, but as a series of steps, some shaky, some firm. For the sanctuary team, these small victories built momentum. Volunteers who had been cautious now found themselves lingering longer by his pen, drawn in by the sight of a cub reclaiming his spirit. They whispered encouragement, snapped photos, and shared updates with donors who had helped fund his care. His story reached beyond the barn walls. In community centers and living rooms, people read about the little grizzly bear cub who had been left for dead and now was wrestling with toys like any young bear should. This ripple effect carried its own lesson when one animal recovers. It doesn't just change one life, it inspires a network of people rescuers, neighbors, supporters to believe their efforts matter. Healing spreads outward, touching those who may never meet the cub, but who now carry a piece of his story in their hearts. Yet even as recovery unfolded, mystery lingered. Would he ever be strong enough to return to the wild? Would he trust humans enough to survive in sanctuary care, yet not so much that he lost the instincts of a wild animal? These questions hung over each milestone unanswered, but they didn't diminish the joy of the present. Each playful growl, each paw print in the dirt was worth celebrating, even without certainty about tomorrow. One powerful example came late one evening. Emily sat near the enclosure, reading notes. The cub approached the fence, pressed his nose through the gap, and sniffed her sleeve. She froze, not wanting to break the moment. For the first time, he had initiated contact. It wasn't affection in the human sense, but it was trust enough to bridge the space between them. Emily wrote that night, "He looked at me not with fear, but with curiosity." That's the clearest sign yet that he's choosing to live with us, not against us. The broader perspective connects here to all wild animals in rescue. Whether it's polar bears struggling on thinning ice, black bears rummaging near towns, or forest animals displaced by wildfires, recovery is never just about body weight or clear lungs. It's about spirit. A wolf pack regaining its rhythm after relocation. A deer is learning to walk again after an injury. A grizzly cub choosing play over fear. These are the deeper markers of survival. The ones that remind us wild lives are more than biology. They are stories of resilience, preventing the suffering in the first place. Laws in Montana make animal neglect and cruelty punishable, but laws are only as effective as the eyes and voices that enforce them. If someone notices a cub in distress, hears cries from an abandoned shed, or sees wild animals mistreated, action must be taken. Silence allows cruelty to grow. Action creates the chance for stories like this cub's. Daniel knew this better than most. He reflected on that first cry in the Rockies. If he had walked on, told himself it was nothing, the cub's story would have ended there. Instead, he listened. And because he listened, the world gained one more chance at recovery. The takeaway for anyone watching is clear. Whether it's a grizzly bear cub in Montana, a stray dog in a city alley, or a bird trapped in wire, recovery begins with someone noticing someone, caring someone, choosing to act. It doesn't require expertise. It requires presence. By the end of his first month at Mountain Haven, the cub had doubled his weight. His coat gleamed in the morning light, and his play sessions filled the barn with sound. Volunteers smiled wider, donors wrote letters of support, and the sanctuary carried new energy. He was no longer just the cub with the cruel note. He was a survivor. But recovery wasn't only his story. His survival asked a bigger question. What about the grizzlies still out there beyond the fences facing struggles he might never know? The cub's recovery carried its own beauty, but as Daniel watched him play, a question kept returning. What about the others? He knew this cub wasn't the only one facing hardship. Across Montana, Wyoming, and Alaska, grizzly bears lived in a balance more fragile than most people realized. One rescued cub could capture hearts, but the bigger picture told a story of survival on a much larger stage. Grizzlies once roamed most of the American West, from the Great Plains to the Pacific Coast. Today, their range is fractured. Populations survive in pockets. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem, the northern continental divide, and the remote stretches of Alaska. Numbers have risen in recent decades thanks to protections, yet the species remains listed as threatened in the lower 48 states. For every cub that thrives in a wildlife rescue or animal sanctuary, many more face challenges in the wild that cannot be solved by medicine alone. Daniel remembered his years as a ranger, tracking bear movements, mapping their encounters with people. He had seen firsthand the tension between wild animals and expanding towns. A grizzly rummaging through garbage bins could spark fear, sometimes leading to deadly outcomes. A mother bear crossing highways with her cubs risked more than just hunger. She risked lives with every step. It's not cruelty like the note we found Daniel once told Emily. It's something harder to untangle habitat. Shrinking people pressing in wild, spaces disappearing. An example came from a case not far from Mountain Haven. A female grizzly known to locals as Willow had raised 3 cubs near a river valley. Each season she returned to the same berry patches. But when new cabins were built nearby, conflicts grew. Residents worried about safety and wildlife officers were called. Willow was eventually relocated deep into the forest. Her cubs survived for a time, but without her, their odds dropped. Only one was seen the following year. That story never reached headlines, but for those in conservation it was a reminder. Even when laws protect reality can still claim lives quietly. Protecting a species isn't only about saving individuals. It's about protecting landscapes, creating corridors for migration, and fostering coexistence between people and wildlife. One cub in a rescue matters deeply, but without healthy ecosystems, countless others will face the same fate, unseen and unrescued. Harris, the vet, explained it to volunteers one evening as they gathered around the sanctuary fire pit. When you see this cub, you see more than just one life. You see what's at stake. Grizzly bears are a keystone species. Their digging spreads seeds, their hunting keeps prey populations balanced, and their presence shapes entire ecosystems. Losing them means losing much more than a single animal. It means unraveling the fabric of the wild. His words framed the cub's story as part of a much larger narrative, one stretching far beyond barn walls. The fresh perspective came when Emily pointed out the ripple effect of compassion. Every time people hear about a rescued grizzly bear cub, they also hear about the threats wild bears face. One story can shift how people see the bigger picture. Maybe someone will stop leaving garbage out. Maybe someone donates to a conservation project. Change doesn't always start with statistics. Sometimes it starts with a cub pushing a log across straw. Statistics still mattered, though. Around 50,000 grizzlies remain in Alaska, but only about 1/500 survive in the lower 48 states. These numbers paint a picture of a species that thrives in the north, but teeters closer to vulnerability in the continental U.S. Endangered animals like the grizzly remind us that survival depends not just on nature, but on human choices. Choices about land use, climate policy, and everyday interactions with wild animals. He's better off gone. Those words echoed not only the malice of one person, but also a mindset that has haunted wild animals for centuries, the belief that they don't belong, that their struggles don't matter. Yet here was proof of the opposite. The cub's recovery showed that kindness could rewrite even the harshest beginnings. The broader challenge was ensuring that the same kindness reached the forests, rivers, and mountains where wild grizzlies still roamed. Community involvement became a crucial piece. Volunteers at Mountain Haven began hosting talks at schools, showing photos of the cub's journey, teaching children about the role of bears in forest ecosystems. Parents listened, often surprised to learn how much grizzlies contributed to healthy landscapes. One boy asked, "What can we do if we see a bear near town?" The answer was simple: secure food, give space, respect boundaries. Education was not glamorous, but it was powerful. Coexistence depends not on removing wildlife, but on adjusting our behavior. Simple actions, locking dumpsters, respecting warning signs on trails, reporting sightings instead of panicking, make survival possible for both humans and bears. These everyday choices shape whether wild animals remain neighbors or become casualties. The cub's story also raised awareness about animal neglect laws. In Montana, cruelty to wild animals is a punishable offense, but enforcement relies on vigilance. Sanctuary staff reminded visitors, if you hear cries from an abandoned shed, if you witness wild animals mistreated, speak up. Silence protects cruelty. Action protects life. The cub's survival was living proof of what happens when someone speaks. Daniel carried this thought each time he returned to the sanctuary. He would watch the cub wrestle with straw paw at water buckets, tumble across the ground, and wonder about the unseen cubs out there. How many voices went unheard? How many crates remained hidden in the woods? The mystery of what we don't see pressed heavily on the cruelty he had found. It was a reminder that every choice to care, no matter how small, mattered against the silence. The takeaway for viewers, then, is not just to marvel at one cub's recovery, but to see him as a mirror of something larger. Protecting grizzlies means protecting wild spaces. It means remembering that every abandoned soul, whether in a barn, a crate, or a shrinking forest, deserves a chance. It means recognizing that our role is not separate from the wild, but intertwined with it. By the time the cub reached his second month at Mountain Haven, he had grown strong enough to climb, run, and wrestle. His recovery filled hearts with hope, but his story pointed beyond himself. He became a symbol of resilience, yes, but also a reminder of responsibility. And as the cub's strength grew, it became clear that saving him wasn't a task for one man or one sanctuary. It was a community effort, a web of compassion stretching far beyond the rescue barn. When the cub's story first reached the local paper, it was only a few paragraphs tucked between farm reports and town council updates. A retired ranger had found a grizzly bear cub abandoned in the Rockies. The note that condemned him had become the symbol of cruelty. The rescue that followed had become the symbol of something else. At first, readers reacted with sadness. Then the calls began. Mountain Haven. Wildlife Rescue started receiving donations, small checks in handwritten envelopes, jars of coins dropped off by school children, emails offering blankets, formula, even handmade toys. A woman from Bozeman sewed quilts stitched with paw prints. A retired teacher baked bread for the volunteers pulling long shifts. The cub who had once been left with nothing now had a community gathering around him. This wasn't just about money. It was about presence. Volunteers signed up to work the late-night shifts, sitting quietly by the enclosure, making sure the cub was warm and fed. Marcus noticed something had changed in those hours. People who had never handled wild animals before learned to move gently, to listen more than they spoke, to let the cub dictate the pace. "He's teaching us," Marcus said one night. Patience, maybe. Or just how to sit still and care without asking for anything back. An example came during a weekend open house. Families gathered at the sanctuary, not to see the cub directly. He was kept away from crowds to reduce stress, but to hear his story. Emily showed slides of his progress: first feeding, first play, first climb. Children leaned forward, eyes wide, as she explained how wildlife rescue worked. One boy whispered to his mother, "I want to help bears when I grow up." That moment carried weight. Compassion had passed from the barn to the next generation. Compassion multiplies. One act of care does not remain alone. It invites others to step forward to carry a piece of the burden, to make kindness heavier than cruelty. Daniel may have lifted the cub from the crate, but the community lifted him the rest of the way. What made this effort unique was the range of people involved. Neighbors who had once feared wild animals donated fruit and honey. Hunters who understood the balance of ecosystems gave funds for fencing. School teachers used the cub's story and lessons about endangered animals and the role of sanctuaries. Even local businesses pitched in. Grocers donated produce, ranchers offered space for supplies, and photographers donated wildlife photography prints for fundraising. Compassion crossed boundaries that often divided people. The fresh perspective emerged as Harris reflected during a volunteer meeting. We often think of rescues as single events, a bear pulled from a trap, a cub saved from abandonment. But really, rescue is a web. Each thread is a person, a choice, a moment of care. Alone, they might seem small. Together, they hold up a life. His words carried into the silence, reminding everyone why they were there. One evening, Daniel returned to find the barn filled with chatter. Volunteers were weaving enrichment toys out of ropes and logs. A local musician strummed softly in the background. The cub, tucked in his enclosure, batted a hanging ball with one paw, while voices outside spoke of hope and commitment. For Daniel, who had first heard only a lonely cry in the mountains, the contrast was striking. The cub had gone from forgotten to surrounded, from silence to song. It was not just about saving one grizzly bear cub. It was about rediscovering the strength of collective compassion. People who might never meet in other contexts, retirees, students, ranchers, hikers, were finding common ground in the life of a wild animal. This bond reached beyond the sanctuary. Conversations at local diners shifted from weather to wildlife rescue. Social media posts about the cub gathered hundreds of shares, spreading his story far beyond Montana. The person who had abandoned him was never found. The note remained in the sanctuary office, a reminder of the cruelty that had started it all. But as weeks passed, its power diminished. What had once been a mark of despair was now a backdrop for something stronger. Community erased isolation. Compassion outshone cruelty. Compassion is not passive. It asks for action, donating, volunteering, advocating, and learning to coexist with wild animals. Even small steps matter. Securing garbage bins protects bears from dangerous encounters. Supporting animal sanctuaries provides resources for wildlife rescue. Teaching children about forest animals builds empathy for the future. Each act, however ordinary, ties into the web that saves lives. Daniel often reflected on his own role. At first, he had believed the cub's survival rested solely on his decision to carry him down the mountain. Now he saw it differently. His choice had simply lit the first spark. Others had carried it forward, each adding fuel until the fire of compassion burned too bright to ignore. This realization shifted his perspective. Heroism wasn't about one act. It was about being part of something greater than yourself. The sanctuary staff echoed this view when they spoke at community gatherings. "You may not climb mountains or treat animals in clinics," Emily told a crowd in Missoula, "but you are part of this rescue. Every dollar, every word shared, every moment of care builds the net that holds our wildlife." Applause followed not for the sanctuary, but for the shared sense of belonging. By the third month, the cub's recovery had become a community story, not just a sanctuary update. Local radio stations reported on his milestones. A high school art class painted murals of wild animals with the cub at the center. Farmers organized a fundraiser selling pies to support veterinary care. Compassion had woven itself into the daily rhythm of the town. The broader perspective connects here in a world where news often amplifies division and despair. Stories of rescued wild animals remind us of another truth, that communities can unite around kindness. A cub abandoned with a cruel note became the reason neighbors sat at the same table, shared meals, exchanged stories, and found common ground. That is the power of compassion. By then, the cub had grown confident enough to wrestle with enrichment toys, climb logs, and splash in shallow water. Each playful leap mirrored the collective effort behind him. His recovery was no longer a solitary story. It was a shared victory. But as his strength returned, a harder question waited. Where should a wild soul belong, back in the forests that once abandoned him, or within the safety of sanctuary walls? By the time spring thawed the snow in Montana's valleys, the cub was unrecognizable from the fragile creature Daniel had carried out of the Rockies. His coat-gleamed muscles filled his frame, and his playful energy filled the barn with noise each morning. He could run, climb, and wrestle ropes with the same wild strength any young grizzly should. With health restored, the hardest question emerged: where should he belong? The sanctuary team gathered around a long wooden table to discuss his future. Harris spoke first, laying out the facts. A grizzly bear cub learns nearly everything from his mother, the roots to food, the signals of danger, the rhythm of the seasons. Without her, survival in the wild is a gamble. Releasing him too early could mean sending him to a slow death. His words settled heavily in the room. Marcus countered gently. But he is still a wild animal. Keeping him here forever changes his story. Shouldn't he have the chance to live where he was born, in the forest? The debate reflected a larger dilemma faced by every wildlife rescue, balancing the instinct to return animals to the wild with the responsibility to protect them from harm. An example came from another rescue a few years earlier. 2 orphaned grizzly bear cubs had been released into a remote valley in Wyoming. At first, they thrived. But without guidance, one was struck by a car crossing a highway, and the other, too accustomed to scavenging near humans, was relocated repeatedly before finally vanishing from tracking. The story was a sobering reminder that release without preparation could undo all the effort of rescue. Not every path leads back to where we started. Sometimes the safer, wiser future looks different from the one imagined. For this cub, safety might mean sanctuary, not solitude in the forest. The decision was not made lightly. Experts were consulted, data reviewed, and options weighed. Sanctuaries exist not to replace the wild, but to provide a life when the wild is no longer safe. At Mountain Haven, the enclosures stretched with trees, rivers, and climbing structures designed to mimic natural terrain. Bears there could roam, forage, swim, and wrestle wild animals, living with dignity, though not in complete freedom. Daniel listened quietly through the discussions, his mind returning again and again to the day of discovery. The note nailed to the crate had told him the cub was better off gone. He thought of those words as the team debated his fate. Keeping him in sanctuary wasn't denying his wildness, it was rejecting the cruelty that had nearly erased his life. It was choosing presence over absence, life over loss. A fresh perspective came when Emily spoke softly. Maybe the question isn't whether he belongs in the wild or here. Maybe the question is what gives him the best chance to thrive. Our job isn't to recreate the past. It's to offer him a future. Her words reframed the dilemma, shifting focus from ideals to possibilities. The cub would remain at Mountain Haven, living in a large, naturalized enclosure with other rescued grizzlies. There, he would not be a pet nor a display, but a resident, safe, cared for, still a bear. He would never again face abandonment, nor the silent dangers of highways and shrinking forests. The transition from patient to resident came quietly. Volunteers built new climbing structures, rolled in logs, and dug pools. The cub explored each with the curiosity of youth, splashing water, pawing bark, tumbling with joy. His new life didn't mimic every risk of the wild, but it restored the play, strength, and dignity he had been denied. The takeaway for viewers is clear. Sanctuary is not second best. It is a choice rooted in compassion, shaped by realism. In a world where wild animals face growing challenges, shrinking habitats, human conflict, climate change, sanctuaries stand as places where survival becomes possible again. Not perfect, not wild in the purest sense, but alive, safe, and respected. Daniel visited often, watching the cub grow into a young bear, stronger each time. On one visit, he saw him stand on hind legs, pawing at branches, sunlight gleaming on his fur. In that moment, Daniel felt peace. The cub wasn't lost. He wasn't gone. He was living, and that was enough. Still, a mystery lingered. What would his life have been if not for the crate and the note? The question could never be answered, but perhaps it didn't need to be. The truth lay in the present. The cub had been abandoned, yes, But he had also been rescued, healed, and given a new path. His story no longer ended in despair. The broader perspective echoes here. Wildlife rescue isn't only about restoring what was lost. It's about adapting, finding solutions that honor life even when the wild cannot. Sanctuaries are not prisons, they are bridges. They remind us that compassion is flexible, that it can bend around reality without breaking. By summer, the cub had made friends among other rescued bears. They wrestled, splashed, and shared space under the shade of trees. Watching them, volunteers saw proof that life after rescue could still hold joy. The cub, once defined by a cruel note, was now defined by play, strength, and connection. And in those quiet moments, paws splashing in water bodies, rolling in straw, the story found its real ending. Not just recovery, but a reminder to us all that compassion, when shared, can change even the darkest beginnings. By the end of summer, the cub had become something no one could have predicted on that cold day in the Rockies. He was no longer the frail, shivering creature left behind with a cruel note. He had grown into a young grizzly with strength in his muscles, shine in his coat, and a spark of curiosity in his eyes. Watching him now, it was easy to forget how fragile he once was. But for those who had been there from the beginning, every playful tumble, every paw print in the dirt carried the weight of memory. Daniel visited one afternoon and found the cub splashing in a shallow pool built by volunteers. He watched as the bear pawed at the water, lifted his head, and shook droplets into the air, a moment of pure, unguarded joy. For Daniel, that scene meant more than survival. It meant transformation. The cub was no longer defined by abandonment. He was defined by the love, effort, and compassion that had surrounded him since his rescue. The explanation of why this moment mattered is simple but profound. Wild animals like grizzly bears carry stories larger than themselves. When they recover, they remind us that resilience is possible even in the face of cruelty. They remind us that a single act of kindness, a ranger carrying a cub down a mountain, a vet offering fluids, a volunteer sitting through the night, can tip the balance from despair to hope. This is not just about wildlife rescue. It is about the capacity of humans to rewrite endings. An example of this ripple effect came from the letters Mountain Haven Wildlife Rescue received. A young girl from Wyoming wrote, "I read about the cub and now I pick up trash on my hikes so animals don't eat it." A retired miner sent a note with his donation. I never thought much about bears, but this story made me realize they're a part of our home too. These voices showed that the cub's survival was more than one life saved. It was a reminder to thousands of people that compassion doesn't end at the barn fence. It travels outward, shaping choices, changing habits, and planting seeds of empathy. Cruelty isolates, but compassion connects. The person who left the note acted alone, creating silence and fear. The community that rescued the cub acted together, creating trust and life. The contrast is stark, and it asks each of us a question. When faced with suffering, will we turn away or step closer? Knowledge deepens this reflection. Grizzly bears remain a threatened species in the lower 48 states, with populations fragmented and habitats pressured by human expansion. Sanctuaries like Mountain Haven cannot save them all, but they demonstrate what is possible when people act. Protecting wild animals requires both systemic change laws, conservation corridors, climate action, and personal change, securing trash bins, respecting trails, reporting abuse, supporting sanctuaries. The cub's survival is not just a story of rescue, it is a lesson in responsibility. And yet, mystery lingers, as it often does in stories of wild animals. Who abandoned him? Why, those questions may never be answered. But perhaps the deeper mystery lies not in cruelty, but in resilience. How does a creature so small, so close to death, find the strength to play again, to trust again, to live again? Watching him now, rolling in straw, climbing logs, resting peacefully under the shade of trees, the answer feels less like science and more like grace. Saving wild animals is not about erasing their struggles. It is about walking with them through those struggles and refusing to let cruelty have the final word. The cub's story doesn't deny that suffering exists. It shows that suffering can be met with compassion strong enough to heal. Daniel often thought of that first cry in the forest, how close he came to missing it. He thought of the weight of the cub in his arms, the way each step down the mountain felt impossible and necessary at the same time. Now, watching the cub thrive in the sanctuary, Daniel realized the choice he made that day was not just about one life. It was about affirming that life, any life, is worth carrying. This is where the emotional payoff belongs, not in neat endings, but in reflection. What we do when confronted with cruelty defines us. What we choose to carry, even when it is heavy, shows who we are. The grizzly bear cub story is not simply about animals. It is about us, our capacity for care, our willingness to listen, our courage to act. So here is the invitation, gentle but firm. Reflect on yourself. If you had been in Daniel's place on that cold mountain morning, what choice would you have made? Would you have walked past the cry, convincing yourself it was nothing? Or would you have carried the weight, knowing it might change a life if this story touched you? Let it linger. Let it shape the way you see wild animals, the way you listen to small cries, the way you act when compassion calls. And if you want to keep walking with us through stories like this, stories of wildlife rescue, of grizzly bear cubs, of wild animals finding second chances, then join us here. Like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder of resilience, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next story waiting to be carried. Because somewhere even now, another cry is echoing through the forest, and maybe you will be the one to hear it.